July 1209, southern France. The midsummer sun had not yet risen, and still the air felt heavy as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Béziers, a city built on centuries of trade, culture, poetry, and faith, stood quietly upon its hills, unaware that by nightfall it would vanish in fire, steel, and smoke. This is not a story of armies clashing in honorable battle. This is not a tale of two equal sides fighting for land or gold. This is a story of annihilation, deliberate, merciless, holy annihilation. A story of a crusade not waged against foreign invaders, but against fellow Christians. A story of how an entire city, its people, its culture, its faith was extinguished in a single day. In the name of God, what could compel an army, blessed by the Pope himself, to slaughter without distinction? What belief, what fear, what hunger for power could justify killing 20,000 men, women, and children, Catholic and Cathar alike? To answer that, we must go back. Before the fires, before the screams, before July 1209, we must go back to a church terrified of losing its grip on Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Southern France was not like the North. It was wealthier, freer, more literate, and far more tolerant of religious diversity than most regions of medieval Europe. Here, troubadours performed poetry in grand halls. Merchants enriched cities with far-reaching trade. Families lived under local lords who valued autonomy over blind obedience. And among these hills and market squares lived a people whose beliefs were quietly diverging from the Catholic Church. They called themselves Bons, Homs, good men, good Christians. The world would come to know them as the Cathars. To the Church, Catharism was more dangerous than any pagan cult or foreign enemy. It challenged the Church's wealth, its hierarchy, its authority. The Cathars rejected the materialism of the clergy, condemned corruption among bishops, and preached that true spirituality required simplicity, not gold, not indulgences, not power. Worse still, they believed in a radical dualism, a world torn between a God of pure spirit and a God of corrupt matter. In this worldview, the physical world, its wealth, its church buildings, even its sacraments were corrupt illusions, a threat not just to Catholic doctrine, but to Catholic domination. And so, in January 1208, when the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was murdered, likely by a rogue knight, though the Church blamed the sympathetic nobles of Languedoc, Pope Innocent III did not hesitate. He did what no pope before him had dared. He declared a crusade against Christians. Northern French lords hungry for land saw opportunity. Zealots saw a holy war. Mercenaries saw plunder, and the Church saw a chance to remind Europe that its authority was absolute even over the lives of fellow Christians. The crusade would be led by a man whose name would echo in infamy, Arnaud Amalric, the papal legate whose zeal was matched only by his ruthlessness. His orders were clear: eradicate heresy, by persuasion if possible, by annihilation if necessary. When the crusading host began marching south, Béziers was not their first target, but it was their first test. The city was known for harboring Cathar sympathizers, but it was also filled with Catholics, loyal to Rome. Its clergy remained in good standing. Its bishop warned of rebellion, but pleaded that the innocent should not suffer for the guilty. But such distinctions, in the eyes of Amalric, were luxuries. In a crusade, innocence had little value, and so the army marched thousands of knights, men-at-arms, crossbowmen, foot soldiers, and camp followers. Chroniclers compare the dust of their march to a moving storm cloud. As they approached Béziers, they expected a siege, a negotiation, a formal surrender. They expected the city to hand over its Catholic, or at least pretend to. Instead, what happened would shock even the Crusaders themselves. At dawn on July 22, 1209, the Crusader army encamped outside Béziers' walls. They were preparing siege engines, discussing tactics, sharpening weapons. The mood was tense but confident. For all their zeal, the Crusaders were not prepared for what came next. Inside the walls, the city churned with fear and debate. Some argued that the Cathars should submit, if only to save the innocent. Others insisted that they would rather die than betray their faith. The bishop pleaded for surrender. Many Catholic citizens believed the Crusaders would never harm fellow Catholics. After all, how could they? How could a Catholic army slaughter Catholics? That na vite would cost them everything. The city's young defenders, hot-blooded, proud, enraged by the threat, made a fatal mistake. A small group of boys and young men opened a side gate and rushed out, attacking a handful of Crusaders. It was not a planned defense. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was an impulsive act of courage or foolishness that changed the course of history. What should have been a minor skirmish became a spark thrown into dry tinder when the Crusaders saw the gate open. They surged forward as one. No orders, no strategy, no discipline, just raw, overwhelming force. They charged the open gate and poured into the city like a broken dam. Béziers fell in hours. No siege engines, no ladders, no elaborate tactics, just chaos, shock, momentum, and fear. Crusaders flooded the streets, cutting down anyone who ran, anyone who resisted, anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even among the man whose name would forever be tied to this massacre, admitted later in a letter to the Pope that the city fell without my orders, without consultation, as if by divine impulse. But once the Crusaders entered the city, Amalric did give one order, whether he spoke the words or not. Words so cold, so merciless, so horrifying, that they would echo across history. When asked how to distinguish heretic from Catholic in the chaos, he allegedly replied, "Sedite eos, navit enim, dominus, quae, sunt eos." Kill them all. God will know his own. Did he say it? Chroniclers debated. Caesares of Heisterbach recorded it within living memory. It may have been exaggerated, or symbolic, or entirely true, but in the streets of Béziers, the soldiers acted as though those were the only words that mattered. Men were slaughtered in the market squares. Women were dragged from homes and killed in the streets. Children were cut down as they ran. No one was spared, not the elderly, not the clergy, not the innocent. Blood soaked the cobblestones so deeply that, according to some accounts, it reached to the ankles of soldiers. The people fled where they believed safety still existed. The churches, in medieval Europe, a church was sanctuary, a holy place, a refuge, a place no warrior, no matter how brutal, would defile. And so, hundreds rushed into the church of St. Mary Magdalene, mothers carrying infants, priests clutching relics, elders trembling in prayer, families huddled beneath stone arches, believing that God's house would shield them from God's army. But Béziers was a place where holiness died. According to multiple accounts, the Crusaders did not hesitate. They barred the doors. They piled kindling, and they set the church on fire, burning hundreds alive. The screams echoed against stone, then slowly faded into crackling flames and falling timber. When the fires cooled, only ash and bone remained. Other churches were looted, monasteries ransacked. Priests and monks were killed where they stood. Sacred objects, chalices, reliquaries, manuscripts were stolen or destroyed. Even the cathedral was plundered. In the eyes of the Crusaders, Béziers was not a place to conquer, it was a place to purge. By evening, the city was conquered, but the destruction was not finished. The Crusaders set fire to the city itself. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames. Wooden homes collapsed into embers. Stone structures cracked and blackened. Smoke filled the air, drifting into the night sky like the ghost of a city dying. Some Crusaders looted what remained. Others destroyed simply for the sake of destruction. Amalric later boasted to the Pope that nearly 20,000 had died. Historians believe the number was lower, perhaps 10,000, perhaps 12. But even the smallest estimate makes Béziers the deadliest single-day massacre in medieval European history. By nightfall, Béziers was gone. Not defeated, not occupied, not rebuilt, gone, a blackened shell, a graveyard of ash. Its surviving citizens fled into the countryside, wandering without homes, without families, without hope. Many never returned. The city that had stood for generations thriving, vibrant, proud was abandoned, and the Crusaders marched on, confident, triumphant, terrifying. Their message to the rest of Languedoc was clear: surrender or burn. Cities that followed surrendered quickly. Carcassonne, Albi, countless. Towns saw what had happened and chose submission over extinction. The psychological shock of Béziers was more powerful than any army. But in truth, the Albigensian Crusade was not just about religion. It was about domination. Northern France sought to control the wealthy, culturally independent South. The Church sought to crush dissent before it spread. Kings sought to unify France under a single power, one loyal to Rome and obedient to monarchy. And Béziers became the warning, the symbol, the example. A city destroyed not because it could not defend itself, but because it dared to define itself. Centuries later, the words allegedly spoken by Amalric still echo: kill them all. God will know his own. Whether he spoke them or not, history remembered. History always remembers, especially when mercy does not. But the story of Béziers does not end with the flames that consumed it. No. Béziers was only the opening act of a crusade that would reshape southern France, crush an entire culture, and carve a warning into European memory so deep that 8 centuries later, we still recoil when we hear its name. After the city's death, the crusading army, now swollen with confidence and sanctified in its own brutality, marched deeper into the heart of Occitania. Word of Béziers spread like a plague, carried by terrified refugees. Some fled to Carcassonne, others to Albi. Some simply wandered, dazed and haunted, unsure if their loved ones had survived or been swallowed by the fire. The stories they carried were unbelievable, and yet they were true. An army of Christians had butchered Christians. A crusade meant to protect the church had set churches ablaze. Sanctuary had become a furnace. The surviving towns faced an impossible question. Do we resist and risk the fate of Béziers, or do we bow? Carcassonne chose resistance, but its walls could not protect it forever. Surrounded, starved, and suffocated by the crusading force, the city surrendered within 2 weeks. But because it surrendered, it did not burn. Its people were expelled, forced to leave everything behind, but spared the sword. Even this mercy came with cruelty. They were allowed to leave wearing only their shirts, nothing more, compared to Béziers. This was considered compassion. What followed across Languedoc was not one war, but decades of conflict. Decades of sieges, decades of resistance, decades of executions, trials, and inquisitions. The Cathars, once a thriving spiritual movement, embraced by nobles and peasants alike, dwindled under relentless persecution. Some fled to remote fortresses like Montségur, high in the Pyrenees. Others went into hiding among sympathetic families. Many more faced conversion or death. The crusade eventually shifted from church control to royal ambition. King Louis VIII, and later Louis IX, recognized that the crusade was not merely a war on heresy. It was an opportunity to absorb the wealthy south into the French crown. Land that had once belonged to independent counts now fell under royal rule. The culture of Occitania, its language, its laws, its poetry was slowly smothered. But the Cathars did not vanish easily. For decades after Béziers, they preached in secret, refusing to abandon their beliefs. They held clandestine ceremonies in forests, caves, and abandoned ruins. They smuggled messages across enemy lines. Their resilience enraged the Church, which established the medieval Inquisition, partly in response to their persistence. The final blow came in 1244 at the fortress of Montségur, a place so remote and steep that it seemed unassailable. For 10 months, the last organized Cathar community held out against a determined siege. When Montségur finally fell, more than 200 Cathars refused to renounce their faith. They walked into a giant wooden stockade built at the mountain's base and were burned alive. The same flames that consumed Béziers consumed the last torch of Catharism, and yet, despite everything, the story did not end the way the church intended. Yes, the Cathars were destroyed. Yes, Occitania was conquered. Yes, the church and the French monarchy achieved their political goals. But the massacre of Béziers, this single, devastating day, became something they never expected. A stain on history that time could not wash away. The very brutality meant to terrify the world into submission instead terrified future generations into remembrance. The church would try to justify the crusade for centuries. Chroniclers attempted to defend it as a necessity. Popes argued that heresy threatened the soul of Christendom, but Béziers remained a ghost, a reminder, a question whispered across centuries. What happens when faith becomes a weapon? What happens when certainty becomes cruelty? What happens when salvation becomes slaughter? Because in Béziers, the lines blurred. Heretic and Catholic, guilty and innocent, sinner and saint, all became equal under the sword. And if Amalric truly said the words, "Kill them all, God will know his own," they were more than fanaticism. They were an admission, a confession, a final surrender of moral responsibility. They meant, we no longer care who deserves to die. Judgment is no longer ours to make. We will destroy everything, and God can sort out the pieces. That was the logic of Béziers. That was the logic of holy war. That was the logic of annihilation. But history is a strange judge. It does not always remember victories. It does not always remember conquerors. Sometimes, it remembers crimes, and Béziers became one of them. The city was eventually rebuilt in later centuries, but its medieval Salits people, its culture, its Cathar memory, could never be restored. Today, the modern city stands quietly over the ashes of its past. Tourists walk streets where thousands once died. Churches rebuilt on ruins ring their bells over ground saturated with blood 800 years old. The massacre is not visible, not carved into the stones, not marked with monuments of remorse, but it lingers. It lingers in chronicles. It lingers in legend. It lingers in one chilling sentence that may or may not have been spoken, but whose meaning defined a generation of violence. Kill them all. God will know his own. These words have survived longer than the city that heard them, longer than the faith they sought to protect, longer than the men who carried out the slaughter, longer than the church that attempted to justify it, because words, once loosed into the world, outlive armies, and so does memory. And now, after all the fire, all the destruction, all the centuries of retelling, you the listener stand at the very end of this long, dark chain of history. The question that remains is the same one historians still debate today. Was Béziers destroyed because of ideology, or because of politics? Was it faith that fueled the massacre, or ambition disguised as faith? And once the Crusaders began their assault, once chaos opened the gate, could anything have stopped the avalanche that followed? The truth may be that Béziers died not from one cause, but from many. Fear played a part, hatred played a part, fanaticism played a part, but so did opportunity, so did greed, so did a desire for power, cloaked in holiness. And maybe that is why Béziers still haunts us, not because it was unique, but because it was honest. It showed how thin the line is between piety and violence, how easily humans justify cruelty when they believe heaven approves, how quickly faith can become fire. And that is why we remember Béziers, because it forces us to face a truth we would rather forget. The greatest horrors in history are not always committed by the godless, but often by those convinced they serve God. History remembers, even when mercy does not.